It had been cold all that afternoon. When they picked Hassman up at the gate that evening, it was worse than cold, it was freezing. The gate guard let Hassman wait inside the guard booth, although that was technically against regulations, and he might have caught hell for it if the officer of the day had come by. But it was colder than a witch's tit outside, as the guard put it, and he knew Hassman slightly and liked him, even though he was R.A. and Hassman was National Guard, and he thought that most NG were chicken shit. But he liked Hassman. Hassman was a good kid. They huddled inside the guard booth, sharing a cigarette, talking desultorily about baseball and women, about a court, Marshall and the Gate Guards Battalion, about the upcoming ATT and MOS tests, about the scarcity of promotion slots for corporals and fives. They carefully did not talk about the incident last weekend on the campus in Morgantown, although it had been all over papers and the T-Van had been talked about all over Post. They also didn't talk about where Hassman was going to night aloud off base at a time when almost everyone else's passes had been pulled, although rumors about that had spread through the grapevine with telegraphic speed since Hassman's interview with Captain Symes early that afternoon. Most emphatically, they did not talk about what everyone knew but hesitated to admit even in whispers, that by this time next month they would probably be at war. The gate guard was telling some long, rambling anecdote about breaking up a fight down behind the armor mess hall when he looked out beyond Hassman's shoulder and fell silent, his face changing. "This looks like your ride Jackson," he said quietly after a pause. Hassman watched the car sweep in off the road and stop before the gate. It was a big black caddy, the Post floodlights gleaming from her crust office over polished steel and chrome. "Yeah," Hassman said. His throat had suddenly turned dry, and his tongue bulked enormously in his mouth. He ground the cigarette butt out against the wall. The guard opened the door of the booth to let him out. The cold seized him with his first step outside, seized him and shook him like a dog shaking a rat. "Cover your ass," the gate guard said suddenly from the booth behind him. "Remember, cover your own ass, he." Hassman nodded without looking around, without much conviction. The guard grunted and slid the booth door closed. Hassman was alone. He began to trot toward the car, slipping on a patch office, recovering easily. Hoarfrost glistened everywhere, over everything, and the stars were out in their chill armies, like the million icy eyes of God. The cold air was like ice in his lungs, and his breath steamed in white tatters around him. The driver of the car had the right front door half open, waiting for him, but Hassman, seeing that the man had a woman with him, and feeling a surge of revulsion at the thought of sitting pressed close to the couple in the front open-ed, rear door instead, and slipped into the back seat. After a moment, the driver shrugged and closed the front door. Hassman closed the rear door too, automatically pushed down the little button that locked it, instantly embarrassed that he had done so. After the double thunk of the doors closing and the sharp click of the lock, there was nothing but a smothering silence. The driver turned around in his seat, resting his arm on the top-off seat back, staring at Hassman. In the dark, it was hard to make out his features, but he was a big, beefy man, and Hassman could see the reptilian glint off-light from thick, horn-rimmed glasses. The woman was still facing forward, only casting a quick, furtive glance back at him, and then turning her head away again. Even in this half-light, Hassman could see the stiffness of her shoulders, the taut way she held her neck. When the silence had become more than uncomfortable, Hassman, sir, PFC Hassman, sir stammered, "Sir, I'm the driver," shifted his weight in the front seat. Leather creaked and moaned. "Glad to meet you, son," he said. "Yes, very glad, a pleasure, yes, a pleasure." There was a forced joviality in his voice, a note of strained, dangerous cordiality that Hassman decided he had better not try to argue with. "Glad to meet you too, sir," Hassman croaked. "Thank you, son," the man said. Leather groaned again as he extended his hand into the back seat. Hassman shook it briefly, released it. The man's hand had been damp and flabby, like a rubber glove full of oatmeal. "I'm Dr. Wilkins," the man said, "and this is my wife, Fran." His wife did not acknowledge the introduction, continuing to stare stonily straight ahead, Manners, Dr. Wilkins said in a soft, cottony voice, almost a whisper. Manners. Mrs. Wilkins jumped as if she had been slapped, and then dully muttered, charmed, still not turning to look at Hassman. Dr. Wilkins stared at his wife for a moment, then turned to look at Hassman again. His glasses were dully gleaming blank circles, like opaque portholes. "What's your Christian name, son?" Hassman shifted uneasily in his seat. After a moment's hesitation, as though to speak his name would be to give the other man power over him, he said, "James, sir, James Hassman." "I'll call you Jim, then, Doctor," Wilkins said. It was a statement off act. He was not asking permission, nor was there any question that Hassman would be expected to continue to call him Dr. Wilkins. However free the older man made himself with Hassman's Christian name, or sir. Hassman thought with a quick flash of resentment, you could hardly go wrong calling him sir. Hassman had been in the army long enough to know that it was impossible to say sir 2 times when you were talking to a man like this. Work it in 100 times per sentence, they'd like it just fine. Dr. Wilkins was still staring reflectively at him, as if expected some sort of response, an expression of gratitude for the fine democratic spirit he was showing, perhaps, but Hassman said nothing. Dr. Wilkins grunted. "Well, then, Jim," he said, "you like continental cuisine." I'm not sure, sir," Hassman said. He could feel his face flushing with embarrassment in the close darkness off the cab. "I'm not sure I know what it is." Dr. Wilkins made a noise that was not quite a snort, a long, slow, resigned exhaling off air through the nose. "What kind of food do you like to eat at home?" "Well, sir, the usual king of thing, I guess, nothing special." "What kind of things, Doctor?" Wilkins said with heavy, elaborated patints. "Oh, spaghetti, meatloaf, sometimes fried chicken or cold cuts. We had TV inners a lot." "Doctor?" Wilkins was staring at him. It was too dark to make out his expression with any kind of certainty, but he seemed to be staring blankly, incredulously, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Sometimes my mother'd make, you know, a roast for Sunday or something, but she didn't like to cook anything fancy like that." This time Dr. Wilkins did snort, a sharp, impatient sound. "Dio in teneris consucere multum esti," he said in a loud, portentous voice, and shook his head. Hassman felt his face burning again. He had no idea what Dr. Wilkins had said, but there was no mistaking the scorn behind the words. "That's Virgil," Dr. Wilkins said contemptuously, peering significantly at Hassman. "You know Virgil, sir." Hassman said, "Never mind." Dr. Wilkins muttered. After a heavy pause, he said, "This restaurant we're taking you to tonight has a 3-star Michelin rating, one of the few places east of the Mississippi River that does, outside of New York City. I don't suppose that means anything to you either, does it?" "No, sir," Hassman said stiffly. "I'm afraid it doesn't, sir." Dr. Wilkins snorted again. Hassman saw that Mrs. Wilkins was watching him in the rear-view mirror, but as soon as their eyes met, she turned her face away. "Well, son," Dr. Wilkins was saying, "I'll tell you one thing those 3 Michelin stars mean. They mean that tonight you are going to get the best damn meal you ever had." He sniffed derisively. "Maybe the best damn meal you'll ever have. Do you understand that, Jim?" "Yes, sir," Hassman said. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see that Mrs. Wilkins was watching him in the rear-view mirror again. Every time she thought that his attention was elsewhere, she would stare at him with terrible fixed intensity. She would look away when he met her eyes in the mirror, but a moment later, as soon as he glanced away, she would be staring at him again, as though she couldn't keep her eyes off him, as though he were something loathsome, and at the same time almost hypnotically fascinating, like a snake or a venomous insect. "I don't expect you to appreciate the finer points," Dr. Wilkins said. "We can thank the way kids are brought up totterforth. But I do expect you to appreciate that what you're getting tonight is a very fine meal, one-off, finest meals money can buy, note some slop from McDonald's." "Yes, sir, I do, sir," Hassman said. Dr. Wilkins made a humping noise, not sounding entirely mollified, so Hassman added, "It sounds great, sir. I'm really looking forward to it." "Thank you, sir," He kept his face blank and his voice level, but his jaw ached with tension. He hated being dressed down like this. He hated it. His fingers were turning white where they were gripping the edge off seat. Doctor. Wilkins stared at him for a moment longer, then sighed and turned back to the wheel. They slid away into the darkness with a smooth surge off acceleration. They coasted back down the hill, turned right. Here the road ran parallel to the tall cyclone fence that surrounded the base. Behind the iron mesh, behind the winter striped skeletons off trees, Hassman could see the high cinder bed roofs of the infantry barracks, a huge water tower. It had the slogan "Re-up Army" stenciled on its sides, visible for miles in the daytime, and the gaunt silhouette Ofa derrick, peeking up over the fence from the engineer motor pool like the neck of some fantastic metal giraffe. The base dwindled behind them to a table-top miniature, to a scene the size Ofa landscape inside a tiny glass snowball, and then it was gone, and there was nothing but the stuffy interior off, car, the pale glow off, instruments on the dashboard, dark masses of trees rushing by on either side. Hassman was sweating heavily in spite of the cold, and the upholstery was sticky under his hands. There was a faint but persistent scent off patchouli in the car, cutting across the new car smell off the upholster, and the tobacco, and English leather smell of Dr. Wilkins, that Mrs. Wilkins' perfume it was. Heavy, oversweet smell that reminded Hassman of the room in the cancer hospital where his aunt had died. He longed to roll down the window, let the cold night air into the stuff-a-car, but he didn't quite dare to do it without asking Dr. Wilkins' permission, and that was something he wouldn't do. He was beginning to get a headache, a bright needle of pain that probed in alongside his eyeball like a stiff wire, and his stomach was sick and knotted with tension. Abruptly, it was too much for him, and he found himself blinking back sudden tears off frustration and rage, all the resentment and chagrin he felt rising up in his throat like bile. Why did he have to do this? Why did they have to pick on him? Why couldn't they just leave him alone? He had said as much in Captain Symes' office this afternoon, blurting out, "I don't want to do it." "Do I have to go, sir?" And Captain Symes had studied him with jaundiced eye for a moment before replying, officially, "No. The regulations say we can't make you. Unofficially, though, I can tell you that Dr. Wilkins is a very important man in this state, and with things as tense as they are politically, you can expect some very serious smoke to be brought down on your ass if you don't do everything you can to keep him happy, short off dropping your drawers and bending over." And then Symes had leered at him with his eroded, prematurely old face and said, "And hell, soldier, comes right down to it. Maybe you even ought to take that under advisement." They drifted past a weathered wooden bam that was covered with faded old Clabber Girl and Jesus Saves signs, past a dilapidated farmhouse where one light was burning in an upstairs window. There was an automobile up on blocks in the snow-covered front yard, its engine hanging suspended from a rope thrown over a tree branch. Scattered automobile parts made hummocks in the snow, as if small dead animals were buried there. They turned past a bullet-riddled highway sign and onto an old state road that wound down out off foothill country. The car began to pick up speed, swaying slightly on its suspension. "You come from around here, Jim." Dr. Wilkins said. "No, sir," Hassman said. "Thank God," he added silently to himself. Evidently had been unable to keep his feelings out off High's voice, because Dr. Wilkins glanced quizzically at him in the rearview mirror. Quickly, Hassman added, "I was born in Massachusetts, sir." "A small town near Springfield." "That's so," Dr. Wilkins said without interest. "Gets pretty cold up there, too, in the winter, doesn't it? So at least you're used to this kind of weather, right?" "That's right, sir," Hassman said leadenly. "It gets pretty cold there, too," Dr. Wilkins grunted. Even he seemed to realize that his attempt at small talk had been a dismal failure, for he lapsed into a sodden silence. He pressed down harder on the accelerator, and the dark winter-town tri-side began to blur outside the windows. Now that they had stopped talking, there was no sound except for the whine-off, tires on macadam or their snare drum rattle on patches off gravel. Hassman rubbed his sweating palms against the slick upholstery. Somehow, heck knew that Mrs. Wilkins was watching him again. although it was too dark to see her eyes in the mirror anymore. Occasionally, the light's often oncoming car would turn the inside off, windshield into a reflective surface, and he would be able to see her plainly for a second, a thin-faced woman with tightly pursed lips, her hands clenched together in her lap, staring rigidly straight ahead off her. Then the light would fade and her image would disappear, and only then, in the darkness, would he begin to full her eyes watching him again, as though she were only able to see him in the dark. They were going faster and faster now, careening down the old state road like a moonshiner on a delivery run with the alcohol tax agents on his tail, and Hassman was beginning to be afraid, although he did his best to sit still and look imperturbable. The old roadbed was only indifferently maintained, and every bump rattled their teeth in spite of Caddy's heavy-duty shocks. Once Hassman was bounced high enough to bang his head on the roof, and the car was beginning to sway ominously from side to side. Fortunately, they were on a level stretch of road with no oncoming traffic with they hit the patch office. For a moment or two, the caddy was all over the road, skidding and fishtailing wildly, its brakes screaming and its tires throwing up clouds of black smoke. And then slowly, painfully, Dr. Wilkins brought the big car back under control. They never came to a complete stop, but they had slowed down to about 15 miles per hour by time Dr. Wilkins could wrestle them back into their own lane, and you could smell burned rubber even inside the closed cab. No one spoke. Mrs. Wilkins had not even moved, except to steady herself against the dashboard with one hand, an almost dainty motion. Slowly, almost involuntarily, Dr. Wilkins raised his head to look at Hassman in the rearview mirror. Almost lost it, didn't you, old man? Hassman thought, staring impassively back at him, and after a moment Dr. Wilkins looked shakily away. They began slowly to pick up speed again, wobbling slightly, although Dr. Wilkins was careful to keep them under 50 this time. This compulsive speeding, obviously pushing himself to or beyond the edge of his driving ability, was the first real indication of strain or tension that Dr. Wilkins had allowed to escape from behind his smooth, hard-lacquered facade, and Hassman greeted it with interest and a certain degree of vindictiveness. A few minutes more brought them out off hills. They slowed down to rattle across a small chain-link bridge over a frozen river. A tank was parked to one side off the road near the bridge entrance, its hatch open for ventilation, gray smoke panting from its exhaust and rising straight up into the cold air. A soldier in a steel helmet popped his head up out of the driver's hatch and watched them as they passed. They weren't putting up roadblocks and regulating civilian traffic yet, Hassman thought, in spite of recent wave of tourism, but it obviously wasn't going to be too much longer before they were. There was a small town. On the other side off bridge, half a dozen buildings clustered around a crossroads. Political graffiti had been spray painted on several of the buildings, particularly on the blank-faced side wall of a boarded-up gas station. Yankees go home. Feds out of West Virginia now secession, not recession. Fuck the Union. A sloppy, half-hearted attempt to obliterate the graffiti had been made, and only a Fueliter's Ofach slogan remained, but Hassman had seen them often enough elsewhere to have little difficulty reconstructing them. The restaurant was a mile beyond the town, a large stone and timber building that had once been a grinding mill. No hidden spotlights splashed the ivy, covered walls with pastel lights, and the big wooden water wheel was sheathed in glistening ice. There was a network news van parked in front of the restaurant, and Dr. Wilkins, who had been anxiously checking his watch on the last stretch from town, grunted in satisfaction when he saw it. As they pulled up, a news crew with a minicam unit climbed out of the van and took up position in front of restaurant steps. Other reporters got out of their parked cars, pinching out unfinished cigarettes and carefully tucking them away, and began to saunter over as well, some of them slapping themselves on the arms and joking with one another about the cold in low, rapid voices. Hassman heard one of the reporters laugh, the sound carrying clearly on the cold winter air. Dr. Wilkins switched off the ignition, and they all sat motionless and silent for a moment, listening to the metallic ticking noises the engine made as it cooled. Then, with forced brightness, Dr. Wilkins said, "Well, we're here, everybody out." Mrs. Wilkins ignored him. She was staring out at the gathering knot of reporters, and for the first time she seemed shaken, her icy composure broken. "Frank," she said in an unsteady voice, Frank, I can't face them, I can't." She was trembling. Dr. Wilkins patted her hand Perfunctorily, he noticed Hassman watching them and glared at him with murderous resentment, his careful mask slipping for a moment. Hassman stared stonily back. "It'll be all right, Fran," Dr. Wilkins said, patting her hand again. "It's just until we get inside." Julian promised me that he wouldn't let any of them into the restaurant. Mrs. Wilkins was shaking her head blindly. "It'll only be a minute. Let me do all the talking." "It'll be okay, you'll see." He looked coldly at Hassman. "Come on," he said brusquely to Hassman, and got out of the car. He walked quickly around to the passenger side, opened the door, and said, "Come on," again, to his wife this time, in a low, coaxing tone an adult might use to a frightened child. Even so, he had to reach down and pull her to her feet before he could get her out of the car. He bent to look at Hassman again. "You too," he said in a harsh, dangerous voice. "Come on. Don't give me any trouble now, you little shit." "Get out." Hassman climbed out off the car. It was colder than ever, and he could feel the clammus, wet drying on his body with a rapidity that made him shiver. Dr. Wilkins came up between him and Mrs. Wilkins and took each of them by the arm, and they began walking toward the restaurant. The reporters were looking toward them now, and the camera lights on the van came on, nearly blinding them. Dr. Wilkins kept them walking right at the reporters. The small crowd parted and reformed around them, swallowing them, and then it seemed to Hassman as if everything was happening at once, too fast to follow. Face jostled around him, faces thrust forward toward him, their mouths opening and closing, voices gabbled. A reporter was saying, with the ratification vote on the act of secession coming up in the State House Wednesday, and similar votes later this week in Michigan, Ohio, and Colorado, and Dr. Wilkins was waving his hand airily and saying, more than enough support on the floor. Another reporter was saying something to Mrs. Wilkins, and she was dull muttering, I don't know, flashbulbs were popping at them now, and they had climbed way up the restaurant steps. Someone was thrusting a microphone into Hassman's face and bellowing, "Make you feel," and Hassman was shrugging and shaking his head. Someone else was saying, latest Gallup poll shows that 2/3 of the people of West Virginia support secession, and Dr. Wilkins was saying, everything you hear, love. And the reporters laughed. Hassman wasn't listening anymore. Ever since last weekend, he had been walking around like a somnambulist, and now the feeling had intensified. He felt feverish and unreal, as if everything were happening behind a thin wall of insulating glass, or happening to someone else while he watched. He barely noticed that Dr. Wilkins had stopped walking and was now staring directly into the blinking eye of the minicam, or that the reporters had grown curiously silent. Dr. Wilkins had let his face become serious and somber, and when he spoke this time it was not in insouciant tone he'd been using a moment before, but in a slow, sincere, gravelly voice. The voice seemed to go on and on and on, while Hassman shivered in the cold wind, and then Dr. Wilkins' heavy hand closed over Hassman's shoulder, and the flashbulbs went off in their faces like summer lightning. Then Julian was ushering them into the restaurant, fawning shamelessly over Dr. Wilkins and promising to take their order personally. And shutting the reporters outside, he led them through the youngly interior of the old mill to a table in a cummer nook where the walls were hung with bronze cooking utensils and old farm implements, and then buzzed anxiously around Dr. Wilkins like a fat, unctuous bee while they consulted the menu. The menu had no prices, and as far as Hassman was concerned, might just as well have been written in Arabic. Mrs. Wilkins refused to order, or even to speak, and a rigid silence event to ally embarrassed even Julian. Impatiently, Dr. Wilkins ordered for all of them, making a point of asking Hassman, with thinly disguised sarcasm, if the Kolibiak of salmon and the osso bucco would be to his liking, and Julian hurried gratefully away. Silence settled over the table. Dr. Wilkins stared blankly at Hassman, who stared blankly back. Mrs. Wilkins seemed to have gone into shock. She was staring down at the table, her body stiffly erect, her hands clenched in her lap. It was hard to tell if she was even breathing. Dr. Wilkins looked at his wife, looked away. Still no one had spoken. "Well, Jim," Dr. Wilkins started to say with leaden joviality, "I think you'll like." And then he caught the scorn in the look that Hassman was giving him and let the sentence falter to a stop. It had become clear to Hassman that Dr. Wilkins hated him as much as or more than his wife did, but in spite of that, and in spite of the fact that he had already gotten as much use out of Hassman as he was going to get, he was too much the politician to be able to stop going through the motions of the charade. "Doctor," Wilkins locked eyes with Hassman for a moment, opened his mouth to say something else, closed it again. Abruptly, he looked tired. A smooth, silent waiter placed their appetizers in front of them, glided away again. Slowly, Mrs. Wilkins looked up. She had one off those smooth Barbie, doll faces that enable some women to look 30 when they are 50, but now her face had harsh new lines in it, as if Somione had gone over it with a needle dipped in acid. Moving with the slow-motion grace of someone in a diving suit on the bottom off, she reached out to touch the linen napkin before her on the table. She smiled fondly at it, caressing it with her fingertips. She was staring straight across the table at Hassman now, but she wasn't seeing him. Somewhere on its way across the table, her vision had taken the sort of right-angle turn that allows you to look directly into the past. "Frank," she said, in a light, amused, reminiscent tone unlike any that Hassman had heard her use. "Do you remember the time we were having the Grangers over for dinner, back when you were still in City Council? And just before they get there, I realized that we'd run out of clean napkins." "Doctor?" Wilkins said waningly, but she ignored him. She was speaking to Hassman now, although he was sure that she still wasn't Fran seeing him as Hassman. He was merely filling the role off listener, one of the man-of-egg someones she'd told this anecdote to, for it was plain that she'd told it many times before. "And so I gave Peter some money and sent him down to the store to buy him some napkins. Even paper ones were better than nothing." She was smiling now as she spoke. "So after a while he comes back, the Grangers were here by then, and he comes marching solemnly right into the living room, where we're having drinks, and he says he must have been about 5. He says I looked all over the store, Mom, and I got the best ones I could find. These must be really good because they're sanitary ones. See? It says so right on the box," and he holds up this great big box of Kotex. She laughed, and he looked so intent and serious, and he's so proud off being a big enough boy to be given a job to do, and he's trying so hard to do it right and please us. It just didn't have the heart to scold him, even though old Mr. Granger looked like he'd just swallowed his false teeth, and Frank choked and sprayed his drink all over the room. Still smiling, still moving languidly, she picked up her fork and dug it into one of the Hervelian shrimp quenelles, and then she stopped, and her eyes cleared, and Hassman that all at once she was seeing him again. Life crashed back into her face with shocking suddenness, like a storm wave breaking over a seawall, flushing it blood red. Abruptly, spasmodically, viciously, she threw her fork at Hassman. It bounced off High's chest and clattered away across the restaurant floor. Her face had gone white now as rapidly as it had flushed, and she said, "I will not eat with the man who murdered Meissen." When Hassman stood up, he heard his own voice saying, "Excuse me," in a polite and formal tone, and then he had turned and was walking blindly away across the restaurant, somehow managing not to blunder into any off other tables. He kept walking until a rough, hewn door popped up in front of him, and then he pushed through it and found himself in the washroom. It was cold and dim and silent in the washroom, and the air smelled of cold stone and dust and antiseptic, and, faintly, of ancient piss. The only sound was the low rhythmic belching and gurgling off cisterns. Agit of freezing air was coming in through a crack in the window molding, and it touched Hassman's skin like a needle. He moved to the porcelain wash basin and splashed cold water over his face, the way Thitto in the movies, but it made him feel worse instead of better. He shivered. Automatically, he wet a tissue and began to scrub at the food stain that Mrs. Wilkins' fork had left on his cheap pin-striped suit. He kept catching little glimpses of himself and the tarnished old mirror over the wash basin, and he watched himself slyly, fascinated without ever looking at himself straight on. They had film footage of his killing the Wilkins boy. That particular stretch of film had been shown over and over again on TV since last weekend. As the demonstrators rushed up the steps of the campus administration building toward the line of waiting guardsmen, There was a very clear sequence off eyes bringing his rifle up and shooting Peter Wilkins down. Other guardsmen had fired, and other demonstrators had fallen 4 dead and 3 others seriously wounded. All told, but there could be no doubt that he was the one who had killed Peter Wilkins. Yes, that one was his, all right. He leaned against the wall, pressing his forehead against the cold stone, feeling the stones suck the warmth from his flesh. For some reason, he found himself thinking about the duck I'd raised, one off. Summers they still went to the farm, the duck they'd wryly named Dinner. He'd fattened that stupid duck all summer, and then when it was time to kill it, he'd barely been able to bring himself to do it. He'd made a botch of cutting its head off, faltered on the first stroke, and then had to slash 2 more times to get the job done. And then the duck had run headless across the farmyard, spouting blood, and he'd had to chase it down. He'd given it to his father to clean, and then gone off, behind the bam, to throw up. All the rest of the family had said that the duck was delicious, but he'd had to leave the table several times during the meal to throw up again. How his father had laughed at him. Hasman was shivering again, and he couldn't seem to make himself stop. As clearly as if it was really in the room with him, he heard Captain Syme's voice saying he's mousetrapped himself into it. His son was one of the ringleaders in planning the campus rally, and he was getting a lot of local media coverage simply because he was Wilkins' son. So, just before the rally that weekend, Wilkins published an open letter in all the major papers. A doctor, Wilkins' voice, resonant and sonorous as he stares into the camera lights. In that letter, I told my son that if were killed while taking part in a riot that he himself had helped to create. Well, I told him that I would mourn him forever, but that far from condemning the man who killed him, I'd seek that man out and shake his hand, and then take him out to dinner to thank him for having the steadfastness to see uphold the Constitution of the United States in the face of armed and so stuck with doing it or losing what little face he has left. Syme's voice again, Syme's giggle. He'd talked to Symes for nearly 20 minutes before he'd realized that the tall glass of iced tea in Syme's hand was actually 100 proof whiskey, and by that time Symes had been glassy-eyed and swaying, mumbling, a civil war. And none off Thigh's nuclear exchange shit, either. They're going to fight this one house to house through every small town in America. A nice long war. Hasman stared at himself in the mirror. His face was hard and drawn, gaunt, his cheeks hollowed. His eyes were pitiless and cold. He could not recognize himself. The stranger in the mirror stared unwinkingly back at him. His face was like stone, the kind of cold and ancient stone that sucks the heat from anything that touches it. A nice long war. He went back into the restaurant. Heads turned surreptitiously to watch him as he passed, and he could see some off, other diners leaning close to each other to whisper and stare. Dr. Wilkins was sitting alone at the table, surrounded by untouched dishes of food, some of them still faintly steaming. As Hasman came up, he raised his head, and they exchanged bleak stares. He had taken his glasses off, and his face looked doughy and naked without them, less assured, less commanding. His eyes looked watery and tired. Julian is letting Mrs. Wilkins lie down and back for a while. Doctor, Wilkins said, until she feels a little better. Hasman said nothing, and made no attempt to sit down. Dr. Wilkins reached out for his glasses, put them on, and then peered at Hasman again, as if to make sure that he was talking to the right man. He drew himself up in his chair a little, glancing eye at the nearest table with a motion of the eyes so quick as to be nearly imperceptible, like the flick of a lizard's tongue. Was he worried that, in spite of Julian's promise, some off other customers might be reporters with hidden directional mics? Some off them might be, at that. I guess owe you an apology, Doctor, Wilkins said heavily after a pause. He worked his mouth as if he was tasting something unpleasant, and then continued to speak in a stiff, reluctant voice. My wife's been under a lot of emotional strain lately. She was distraught. You'll have to make allowances for that. She doesn't realize how hard this has been on you, too, how unpleasant it must have been for you to be forced to take a human life. No, sir. Hasman said in a clear, distinct voice, interrupting, not knowing. What words he was speaking until he heard them leave his lips, feeling the final insulating thickness off glass shatter as he spoke, and all the raw emotional knowledge he'd been trying to den for more than a week rush in upon him. Knowing even as he spoke that speaking these words would change him irrevocably forever, change Dr. Wilkins, change everything, watching Dr. Wilkins' face already winking at the blow he could sense coming. Seeing the headless duck run flapping through the dusty farmyard, his father laughing, Mrs. Wilkins' eyes watching him in the rear view mirror in the dark, the soldier popping his head up out off, tank hatch to watch them pass. Fuck the Union, a nice long war, the hard, merciless eyes off the stranger in the mirror, the stranger that was now him. Remembering the clean, exhilarating rush-off joy, the fierce leap of the heart, as he'd emptied the clip of his semi-automatic rifle into the onrushing figure, relishing the flaring blue fire and the smoke and the noise. Good to you, you bastard, got you, smashing the other man and flinging him aside in a tangle off broken limbs all in one godlike moment with a flick-off. His finger, no, sir, he said, smiling bleakly at the tired old man, enunciating each word with terrible precision, not even, at the end, wanting to hurt the other man, but simply to make him understand. I enjoyed it, he said, knowing what words he was speaking until he heard them leave his lips, feeling the final insulating thickness off glass shatter as he spoke, and all the raw emotional knowledge he'd been trying to den for more than a week rush in upon him. Knowing even as he spoke that speaking these words would change him irrevocably forever, change Dr. Wilkins, change everything, watching Dr. Wilkins' face already winking at the blow he could sense coming. Seeing the headless duck run flapping through the dusty farmyard, his father laughing, Mrs. Wilkins' eyes watching him in the rear view mirror in the dark, the soldier popping his head up out off, tank hatch to watch them pass. Fuck the Union, a nice long war, the hard, merciless eyes off the stranger in the mirror, the stranger that was now him. Remembering the clean, exhilarating rush-off joy, the fierce leap of the heart, as he'd emptied the clip of his semi-automatic rifle into the onrushing figure, relishing the flaring blue fire and the smoke and the noise. Good to you, you bastard, got you, smashing the other man and flinging him aside in a tangle off broken limbs all in one godlike moment with a flick-off. His finger, no, sir, he said, smiling bleakly at the tired old man, enunciating each word with terrible precision, not even, at the end, wanting to hurt the other man, but simply to make him understand. I enjoyed it, he said, knowing what words he was speaking until he heard them leave his lips, feeling the final insulating thickness off glass shatter as he spoke, and all the raw emotional knowledge he'd been trying to den for more than a week rush in upon him. Knowing even as he spoke that speaking these words would change him irrevocably forever, change Dr. Wilkins, change everything, watching Dr. Wilkins' face already winking at the blow he could sense coming. Seeing the headless duck run flapping through the dusty farmyard, his father laughing, Mrs. Wilkins' eyes watching him in the rear view mirror in the dark, the soldier popping his head up out off tank hatch to watch them pass. Fuck the Union, a nice long war, the hard, merciless eyes off the stranger in the mirror, the stranger that was now him. Remembering the clean, exhilarating rush-off joy, the fierce leap of the heart, as he'd emptied the clip of his semi-automatic rifle into the onrushing figure, relishing the flaring blue fire and the smoke and the noise. Good to you, you bastard, got you, smashing the other man and flinging him aside in a tangle off broken limbs all in one godlike moment with a flick-off. His finger, no, sir, he said, smiling bleakly at the tired old man, enunciating each word with terrible precision, not even, at the end, wanting to hurt the other man, but simply to make him understand. I enjoyed it, he said.